Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War.
I stood still for seconds in front of this white stripe that represented the border and thought of my father and what all this would do to him, and whether my actions now and here could have serious consequences for our whole family. If I did cross the stripe, nothing will be the same as it used to be.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand Cold War history accounts. Please follow us in your podcast app so you don't miss a single episode. Katja Hesse, daughter of Vice Admiral Gustav Hesse of the East German Navy, shares her deeply personal story of growing up behind the Iron Curtain. In this fascinating conversation, Katja provides rare insights into life in the GDR as a child of a high-ranking officer, from an idyllic childhood in privileged housing to working at the Grand Hotel Berlin. She recounts her father's harrowing World War II escape from the Sudetenland, her experiences of political indoctrination in school, and life within a family loyal to the East German government. This is a moving and revealing glimpse into a unique Cold War upbringing. I'm delighted to welcome Katja Hesse to our Cold War conversation. Katja, welcome to Cold War Conversations.
Hello, Ian. Nice to see you here. Finally. We did it after 6 years. Wow.
Yeah, this has taken a long time to come together, but I'm really glad that we've managed to pull this together and speak about your father and your experiences in East Germany as well.
Yes, sure. First of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me to one of your podcast episodes and for giving me the chance to provide you with my point of view and the view of my father, Vice Admiral Gustav Hesse, about the GDR and the history of our country. And I'm also very proud of my background, and I'm a true kid of the GDR. And I'm very proud of what my father achieved in the 40 years of our republic.
Well, thank you for that. But first of all, I'll start where I start with most of my guests, which is when and where were you born?
So I was born in July 1969, or how Bryan Adams would say in the summer of 69, in Greifswald, a little city in what was then the east of the GDR. My parents hadn't really expected a third child anymore, and I was the big surprise for my parents. My father noted in our family chronicles that my mother did not notice that she was pregnant, but consulted a doctor, fearing some kind of a cyst. The doctor later responded to my mother with a big smile on his face, and there is no cyst, you're pregnant. And this story was often and happily told at family reunions and always made everyone laugh, like me.
That's a brilliant story. So who was actually in your family?
You know, I was born at the third child of my parents, Gustav and Lotte Lore, and my sister Marina was born in 1956, and my brother Ralph in 1961.
So your father had written a diary which you've used to compile a book about his life. Did your father talk about he and his parents' experiences in World War II?
You know, I actually can't remember my father ever hearing him talk about his experiences during World War II. First of all, I was quite young at the time and didn't have much interest in that topic. Secondly, my father has always been very reserved about such matters. The actual experiences he went through, I only learned about through his stories in the family chronicle. He documented everything very precisely and in detail. Looking back, I have to say that reading those lines was very sad for me and also made me quite depressed. The thought that my father was displaced from his homeland along with his mother without money and without a future made me very, very sad from today's perspective. When talking about his experiences during the war, I would like to share a short episode from my father's chronicle. Two things particularly stayed with him from that time. Here are his own words. My mother wrapped several hundred money bills with string and stored them in a box. I was worried about my football shoes, ice skates, and many other small things, but they weren't allowed to come with us. The departure took place amidst the comfort of the local residents and lead us to the border at Schmilka Bad Schandau. That was a little town there. We were escorted by soldiers on horseback who constantly announced that there was strict control at the border and anyone found with items that weren't permitted would be shot. Just before reaching the border, my mother threw the box with the money wrapped in the nearby forest. So we were completely broke. You can imagine our mood when we arrived at the border. My mother then met an old friend who took us without checks all the way to the town. This still brings me to tears today. Yeah, it's very hard. It's very hard.
Katja, your father was he fleeing from East Prussia?
You call this today the Sudetenland. This was Böhmisch land. It belonged to the
Czechoslovakia.
Slovakia, right. That was the part we lived, yeah.
Right, so they were fleeing from the Sudetenland.
Yes.
So the soldiers who were taking them out, were they Czech soldiers or were they German soldiers who were helping with the evacuation?
Czech soldiers.
Right,
Mm-hmm.
right.
Yes.
Okay, got it. Yeah, that must be difficult reading what your father had written down there.
For sure.
When were you first aware of your father's job?
To answer this question, I have to go back a little. I grew up very sheltered and well protected and had a wonderful childhood. My memory of that time is full of happiness. My mother took care of everything and made sure everything worked out well. My father was often out and about, sometimes not at home for weeks. And because of his position, he had a big workload. Of course, I wasn't aware of that as a child. I also remember wonderful holidays with my parents and siblings. We went to socialist countries like Poland or Czechoslovakia. My father was, of course, driven in his Navy limousine with a driver. So were we. My father himself always considered this as a great privilege. He used to say to my sister when she said, "Daddy, can I drive to work in your limousine?" "My child, I worked hard for this privilege and you first have to earn this." Some of my father's drivers had been in my father's service for a very long time, and for this reason, we all had a kind of a friendly relationship with some of them. However, many years after the fall of the wall, I learned that the state security, the Stasi, had used a number of drivers to spy on my father. To us, this felt like a major distrust by the authorities, but my father was aware of this and had no problem with it. At the time, I was confirmed at the age of 14. This is called Jugendweihe. Maybe you know this. It got perfectly clear to me about the significant influence on the system of my father. My father organized a big party in what was then known as the Haus der Armee. That means the house of the army. The building was only available to members of the National People's Army. The public was not even allowed in there. It was a very impressive building with a wow effect, and the classmates we invited were seriously impressed because they would never have had a chance to celebrate in this location in their life. This is why I was very proud that my father was something special, you know?
Yeah, I can understand that. So you went on holiday with your father to Czechoslovakia. Did you ever visit the area where he used to live as a child?
Yes, we made like a remembering trip, kind of remembering trip in the 80s. And then my father showed my mother and me the place where he used to live. But there were actually nothing really left. The houses he lived in and where my grandmother had the business place, it was gone. I don't know why, but my father's school was there and some other places he showed us, and he was actually like very emotional in this time when we went there and see the buildings. Was quite emotional for him, yeah.
Yeah, I can imagine. And did your mother work?
Oh yes, my mother learned the job of a nurse when she met my father in the 50s. They got married and my mother got pregnant with her first child, and then my father was ordered to study in Kaliningrad for 2 years, the Soviet Union in this time. This study was under the highest level of secrecy. No one was really allowed to find out what the officers were doing there. Not even the wives or family members knew anything. This was on purpose set up to this way because the young officers were trained there in the greatest secrecy to become naval officers. You can imagine how difficult it was for a young woman newly married and expecting a baby, and then the man had to leave home for a long time. My father wrote in the family chronicles that my mother had to deal with all the family challenges on her own during the entire time of his studies, and that she also had to raise her first child, my sister. He also said that his daughter Marina saw him more as an uncle than a father because she didn't really know him. This is funny. So my mother stayed a housewife. In later years, around the beginning of the 80s, my mother felt the need to socialize again and found a job at what was then known as the Südstadt Krankenhaus. This is a hospital in Rostock, in my hometown. There she worked part-time and found the work very satisfying.
It's somewhat ironic that your father had to study in Kaliningrad because that was formerly part of Germany prior to the end of World War II and was known as Königsberg.
Right, Königsberg. He was always writing Königsberg actually in the chronicles. I put Kaliningrad in because it's more familiar to the people, maybe that they know it as Kaliningrad, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And what sort of accommodation were you living in? I'm presuming a vice admiral would have somewhere quite nice to live in.
As you can imagine, yes, we lived in various places. I personally only have recollection of two moves my family made, namely the one to Rostock when my father became chief of staff of the People's Navy in 1971, and also deputy to the chief of the People's Navy. Another move was, of course, necessary in a gated area in Rostock, which was guarded and only available to the highest ranking officers in the naval command. We got a beautiful house, so-called double family home. Depending on the position of the officers, you either have a house or an apartment. My father was entitled to a house because of his position. I have very nice memories of this house. I have lived there since I was 4 years old and spent all my childhood and my teenage years there. Very, very nice memories.
Yeah, I think you did say earlier that you had an idyllic childhood, and certainly
Yes.
that sounds like a great place to live in. I mean, did you have to move often because of
Yeah.
your father's position?
My parents themselves very often moved because of my father's position, since he climbed the career ladder at very young age. The leadership positions were, of course, also linked to other locations, which for my mother meant planning a move with 3 children, organizing everything on her own, leave friends, make new friends again. Very, very hard for her. You must not forget that an officer had mainly to serve his country. Family always had to come second, and this was very difficult for many married women. And of course, they were also very lonely, as you can imagine.
What was it like living next to those other well-known NVA admirals like Aim and Hoffman?
You know, I often hear this question. You have to understand that the other admirals and officers also had children. Mostly they were at the same age group as my siblings. I was actually one of the youngest, but did not bother to hang out with the older playmates, you know. The other admirals were also at our homes many times. And I grew up with that type of uncle and aunt thing, you know, meaning close friends of my father's were uncles to me and their wives were like my aunts. And I remember a great solidarity among us, especially because we all shared the same destiny, namely to be children of high-ranking officers. We had a close connection with the Aim family. Aim was the chief of the People's Navy, and whose 3 sons were also good friends with my brother, especially the youngest, Manfred. And I, as the youngest, I was allowed to play with the big ones. For example, with Admiral Theodor Hoffmann's son. He always took me to ride my bike, but I could hardly keep up with him as he was so fast, you know. And the Aim family was very close with my parents, even after the fall of the wall. They helped each other and supported each other in the beginning of the fall of the GDR. Even after Admiral Aim passed away long ago, I always rang Mrs. Aim's doorbell when I was in Rostock and visited her. I never forget what she said. Katja, oh, so nice. Come in and get us a bottle of Rotkäppchen champagne from the cellar. We will drink it together. I have nobody to drink with normally. Then I went to the basement. As a matter of course, our houses were identical, so I had no trouble finding my way to get the champagne. I also have a close friendship with the son of Rear Admiral Herbert Bernig, the last head of the Sea Hydrographic Service, and it always felt like a family reunion when we saw each other. This is also the case for some members of the Aim family, of course. There will always be a family feeling when we see each other, you know?
Yeah. That gives some great insight into what your life was like. So you had plenty of playmates around then?
Yeah, of course. A lot. Yes, a lot. Always funny times.
Did you have any relatives in the West?
Yes, actually, yes. There were relatives on the part of my mother who lived in the West at the time. It was a cousin of my mother. And of course, she was not allowed to have any contact with her, you know, as a child. However, I didn't know this because I was simply too young to understand it. It wasn't until I was a young adult that I found out about such things. And I remember a story that my mother always told sadly when the talk came about Western relatives. When my grandmother died in 1981 at the age of 80, the mother of my mother, she was buried in Zinnowitz on the island of Usedom. And of course, my mother's cousin from Stuttgart came to the funeral with her family. The state security, of course, knew this because my father also had to report such things. And the funeral, the family stood across from each other at the grave. But the Stasi was also there and made sure that my mother and her cousin didn't get too close. You weren't even allowed to hug in mourning. Can you imagine? My mother found this terrible bad and cried for days, but it didn't change the fact that due to my father's function, there were no Western contacts allowed. Yeah, very hard. Very hard.
Wow, that must have been really tough for your mum to see her cousin across the grave and not even, try and comfort each other.
Yeah, she couldn't even talk about this for a long time, She just told me this like when I was already an adult, so that's why I know it,
What sort of privileges did you have as a result of your father's position in the Navy?
Yeah, I remember especially two things. That was on one side the fact that when I was sick, for example, I didn't have to go to the doctor, but the doctor came to our home. There were 3 or 4 medical officers in the Navy who were in command of the so-called Med Point, which was like a small hospital within the People's Navy. These doctors were then called to the home of the Admiralty's children to diagnose a cold or a runny nose or some teething troubles. And I remember well that I had a favorite doctor, and every time my mother had the feeling that I was sick and couldn't send me to school, this doctor was ordered to our home, and that always made me happy as a child, despite my illness, Very funny, actually. The second privilege I remember was when I had to go to the dentist. I was picked up in my father's limousine and taken to the headquarters of the Volksmarine. And where I was received, my teeth were repaired, and then I was driven back home. Of course, as a family, we had the privilege of always being able to travel to good vacation spots, be it in other socialist countries or in the GDR. We always had very privileged vacations in beautiful places. We missed nothing.
And what was your schooling like? Were you in a special school because of your father's job?
No, my school was a completely normal public secondary school as you know it from the GDR with a 10-class system. I started school in Rostock and went to school there for 10 years until graduation. And I would say I had a good time at school. Our teachers were all fine. My class was great too. And I was actually a very good student. Learning was very easy for me. I always had good grades and expected natural school subjects, which was not my passion really. I hated math and always had to make sure that I could get away with a 3. Then 1 was actually the best grade, and 3 was so, comme ci, comme ça. But I was good to very good in all other areas. And my passion was the German language. I could write very well, even as a child. And since my older sister was a teacher in German language and history, I always had, of course, a good support at home. Where I had sometimes issues were political subjects. There, of course, things related to the political system were addressed. I asked uncomfortable questions from time to time, and my teacher said, I shouldn't be so open in expressing my opinions precisely because he knew what kind of family I came from. And from time to time, my father would take me to the side and explain to me why there is an East and the West and that there are no discussions about our class enemy, It's, quite something.
So in your class, were there people from all sorts of different backgrounds?
Yes,
there
sure.
that weren't military?
Definitely. Yeah, it was not only people like me or childs like me. It was from all different families, and that was also very nice, Yeah, I had a good class and good friends. Everything was fine. Everything was good.
Yeah. Were you ever allowed to go and play at their homes or anything like that?
Yes, sure. Yeah, I was. I had great friends, and we had play dates there or in my home or in their home. That was not a problem at all.
Yeah, I bet they enjoy coming to your home.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
What did you do in your spare time?
Like many other teenagers, we had great groups from school and were most of our spare time together. I had 3 2 or 3 close friends at school. With one, I have a very close contact. To this day, we visit each other almost every year, even as a child. I was very fond of reading books with several hundred pages, and I still do that today. Read as much as I can, and I think that you acquire a lot of knowledge through reading. And in my spare time, I also enjoyed doing crafts. For example, I made creative cards for my parents with everything I could get my hands on, newspaper, for example, so articles, pictures, and drawings. My father kept them all and stuck them in our family albums. Today I smile when I see them, and this creative passion has remained true to me until today. And on my 18th birthday, my parents also give me a motorcycle, a so-called Enduro Simpson, which was the model to have at the time. I can tell you, that was great. I had to convince my parents for a long time that they would give me something like this. After all, it was very, very expensive for GDR standards, almost 2,000 Eastmark. My father had to save quite some time for it. Yeah. And when it was in the yard, I was infinitely happy and grateful to my parents, because motorcycling developed into a great passion for me too.
Wow. Wow. What sort of music were you into, Katja?
Music? Actually, we were listening to Western music, and we was...
No, you didn't. Oh.
Yes. There was the NDR, that was like a Western radio station, and we couldn't receive it. And not so good, but we could listen. And there was like a hit parade every, I don't know, maybe Sunday or Saturday. And then we were listening to the Western music, of course. Yeah. Nobody knows for sure, But it was great. And we had all the can you remember, for example, the new wave music? It was like Nena with 99 love balloons.
Yeah.
This type of songs.
Yeah, she was really popular in the West with that song.
Yeah.
Really popular.
And in this time when this music came out, we had like a great music taste. Like the taste of the music from the West was, of course, for us like incredible nice. And so, yeah, to answer your question, yes, I was listening to Western music, yeah.
So you weren't into Karat or the Poodies or anything like that?
Yes, of course, that too, yes. We had every teenager like around me had his favorite group. I was like more Karat than Poodies, but actually we was into all of the music of the East also. Was great music, and today I still listen today to the music of some groups of the East German.
And did your father know you were listening to the Class Enemy?
I really don't know. maybe in today I think my father knew a lot, but he didn't tell me. So I'm sure he knew. Yeah, from point today.
What was your experience like in the Young Pioneers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like all GDR children, I became a young pioneer at a young age. I remember that I was very proud when I was awarded the blue scarf and I was allowed to wear the white pioneer blouse with it. That was in the 2nd grade. And in my testimonials, it was often mentioned that I was a role model in pioneering work, and that I was very enthusiastic about taking part in school events. My sister told me that I was always very involved when it came to class activities. I remember that a so-called group council was formed by the 5th grade, comparable to a kind of committee in which different members of the class were elected and who then vote on activities for the class. It's a little complicated. I was elected chairman in each case because my teacher always attested me a fixed class position, a sense of responsibility, and a great willingness to work. And from a young age, we were formed to be loyal to the party in order to make good and class-conscious people out of us. Because of my father's senior function, it became obvious that the socialist system would also test my loyalty in leadership roles, And later came the time I always enjoyed it, and through my father, I learned to master such leadership role with responsibility. You have to understand, if you grow up like me in a family in which your father is an admiral, where the basic military spirit is lived day by day, it was not difficult to assume leadership roles, but this also requires high demands on yourself, something my father pointed out ongoingly to me. Be strong, take the lead, and help the weak. I have kept this as my approach to live to this very day. Yeah.
So, what sort of propaganda were you being taught at school? Obviously, you've mentioned, being class conscious.
Yes.
You're being instilled in the tenets of socialism at a pretty early age. Then.
Yeah, my siblings, me and many other children grew up with the propaganda of the GDR, and Erich Honecker's name, for example, was already learned in kindergarten, but his title was inexpressible for the little ones, sure. There is also a funny story my sister told me. At the age of 7, I had to go to the dentist, again to the headquarters of the People's Navy. My mother was with me because, of course, I was very scared of it to go to the dentist. And we sat in the waiting room of the medical base. I was on my mother's lap, and there were many officers and sailors there who also had to be treated. And I looked around in the room and then turned to my mother and said loudly and horrified, "Mom, there is no picture of Erich Honecker hanging here." And my mother almost fell off the chair in shock, and the people in the waiting room couldn't help but laugh, And from today's perspective, the GDR propaganda was a double-edged sword, completely over the top, and people knew it too, And people made fun of it in private circles, and many jokes, and including political ones. Their jokes were very popular and mostly came directly from the party officials. I can give you an example if you like. Erich Honecker and Erich Mielke, the chief of the Stasi, are talking. And Mielke asks, "Well, Erich, what is your hobby?" And Honecker says, "I collect the jokes that people tell about me." And Mielke says, "My hobby is very similar. I collect the names of the people who tell the jokes."
That's brilliant. I've not heard that one before. Always love a good East German joke, me.
Yeah. As I said, propaganda began in kindergarten, school, university, and also at the workplaces. But a difference was made between the high demands of the official speech and reality. In official documents, so-called speech bubbles, I don't know if you know that, like in newspapers or so, there were bubbles used, knowing that this was far from what people really thought, but you lived with this contradiction. And for example, my sister told me that in the school class master plan, you had to formulate that the educational goals of the respective class to educate young people in all areas of life, to grow socialist personalities who would always stand up for working class ideals. But you knew that it was not possible to achieve this goal for everyone. Internally, the teachers said if they are polite, helpful, and hardworking, a lot has already been achieved. So there was this contradiction, and most of them were well aware of it. My sister told me that she read a lot during her studies, especially contemporary books from the GDR at the time. and that they described real conflicts that did not always have a positive outcome. The books gave a much better picture of the problems and conflicts of the people in the GDR. And because officially criticism was not welcome and it was dismissed, avoid problems were practically glossed over. In schools, at the university, and in the work collective, there was regular red light exposure. That is, one was trained politically, had to give lectures about leading role of the working class and current political events, and was diligent in discussing it. And of course, always had to state one partisan class point of view. Further professional success depended on this, and they were well aware of that. This political conviction began to crumble at some point because the gap between the party's claims and socialist reality grew larger and larger. And from today's perspective, it seems particularly bad that the state had no confidence in its citizen and that they could not or very rarely visit their family members in the West, for example, despite that many peoples had goodwill for a better GDR, which unfortunately failed, as history has shown us.
So the books that your sister was reading didn't gloss over things. They actually described some of the problems and conflicts that were happening in the GDR. That's really interesting because you wouldn't have expected that necessarily.
Yeah. This is what she told me. You know, I can't remember such things, but she said this to me and I was like, okay, can I write it down to my podcast? And she said, sure, you can. Mm-hmm.
And what did you do after you left school?
When the question came up, what would you like to be later in life? Of course, the discussion about career choice also came up in our family. And I've always had a great affinity for animals and really wanted to do this professionally. Since there weren't many opportunities in this regard in the GDR, the two options were to become a zoo animal keeper or an animal keeper in agriculture. Both were very rare professions, and my parents could finally convince me that this is a very physically demanding job for a woman. And I'm glad they did it. Then I decided to do an apprenticeship in gastronomy. My father had the idea that I could do an apprenticeship at the GDR Council of Ministers. The GDR had a large number of stately guest houses that were subordinated by the government. And of course, they also needed good staff, but mainly they were looking for members of party loyal families like mine, you know. And because of my good references, I got an apprenticeship practically on the spot, which meant I moved to boarding school in Leipzig, far away from my family and friends. And this was, of course, very difficult for me. But my mother did not have long discussions, you know, and demanded that the child show strength. And so in 1986, I began my 2-year training in the guest house of the Council of Ministers of the GDR in Leipzig.
And that was presumably the first time you'd lived away from home?
Yes, that was the first time, yeah. And was very hard for me, I have to say. Very hard, you know, to go away.
I can imagine because, you know, what comes across is you're obviously very close to your family.
Yes, I was always close to my family. And this move was quite something for me. I was 16, you know.
Wow. Yeah. And what was the training like at the guest house? And did you serve any of the big personalities of the GDR?
Oh yeah, I did. The training at the guest house by the government was exceptionally good. I would say it was so good that you could compare it to a modern hotel management school today. Very precise and very detailed and exactly. I remember we were really well trained and prepared to interact with high profile guests, you know. For example, Franz Josef Strauss, who was at the time the Federal Minister of Defense in West Germany. I'm sure you know the name. He was a very prominent and influential politician. And I was selected to stand in the hall with my tray and serve him a cocktail. I will never forget that. It was an extraordinary moment to meet such prominent personalities. And of course, I also served many personalities of our government, such as Erich Honecker, Egon Krenz, or Horst Sindemann, all from our government, you know.
Wow, wow. So you met Erich himself?
Yes,
Yeah.
once.
Okay. What was he like?
You know, actually, like any normal person, he didn't like seems to me very different. He was just the leader, and of course you were looking out to him like with a lot of respect and you know some also like a little fear, you know. But there were actually people like you and me, very normal in acting and not complicated. What can I say from today,
Yeah.
you know?
I don't suppose he shared any of his jokes with you, no?
Yeah, no, no. It would be great if he had. Yes, I
Oh,
will
that
tell
that
you
would
for
have that would have been a great story. But this is a brilliant story
Yeah.
anyway. I'm just incredulous at who you were having these interactions with. Now, your brother also served in the Volksmarine
Yes.
as well as your father. What was he doing there?
Oh, yeah. For my dear brother, who unfortunately died completely unexpectedly in 2014, the career path was, of course, already mapped out, and my father was a role model for all of us, especially for my brother. And Ralph, that was my brother's name, looked up to my father and adored him, and of course wanted his father to be proud of him. And so my brother started a career as an officer right after school. And I have to say that my brother wasn't easy as a teenager. He grew up practically without a father. My mother raised us three children on her own because my father was little or not at home due to his job, you know. And imagine if my mother married my father in 1956, had their first child in July, and later in the year 1957, my father was posted to the Naval War Academy in Leningrad. And in these 3 years, my mother was allowed to visit him twice, and he was also allowed to go back home twice in the whole period. Do you understand what a great burden that puts on this young marriage? It's unbelievable. And my mother felt left alone and was often overwhelmed. Today, I understand her completely, and that these times were very difficult for her. And my brother was born in 1961, and my father's career went unstoppably uphill, which means that his influence was hardly felt in my brother's upbringing. Everything stuck to my mother. And when my father was at home, my brother was very attached to him and sought his closeness, attention, and approval. And for this reason, it was almost as clear that my brother would embark on a military career. He completed an apprenticeship as a car mechanic and then went to a special school for training as an officer in Markkleeberg near by Leipzig. And in 1983, he married his wife, Wiebke. And in the same year, he completed his studies at the Officers College in Löbau and was appointed lieutenant. His first assignment was a section leader with the 6th Coastal Border Brigade, which guarded our state borders at sea. And my brother was always an officer with heart and soul. And when the Berlin Wall came down, he was dismissed from service at the rank of lieutenant commander. And this was very difficult for him. He had very big problems getting used to the new reality, and the collapse of our system and our GDR were a personal defeat for him. And he had big problems finding meaning in life again. And above all, however, he felt a great hate towards West Germany, who accused worthy admirals like my father of having served in an unrecognized army. And for many years, Admiral Ehm, my father, and many others fought for equality between the NVA and the Bundeswehr, unfortunately, to this day in vain, which is also very terrible.
I can understand that because your brother and your father had been loyal to the country that they had grown up in and had served in the army defending that country. And then obviously history came out on the side of West Germany, and the country was effectively absorbed by West Germany. And former East German Army, Navy, and Air Force veterans were treated like second-class citizens.
Yes, that's true. That's true, yeah. Very hard, actually. Even today, when I look back, it's very hard even for me to speak about, because today I can, understand what they were feeling like.
Mm. Mm. Did your brother talk about his role in stopping escapers from the GDR and potentially using deadly force? Did he talk about any incidents or his work?
No, I never heard my brother talk about his role in the GDR border troops. It was not discussed within the family, actually, and I'm sure there was an exchange of views on such issues with my father, but never with the rest of the family. So I can't really remember.
Okay, that's fair enough. Did your father talk to you or mention anything about the Stasi involvement in the Volksmarine?
No, actually not during his service. As I already mentioned, many of my father's drivers were employees of the Stasi. And after the fall of the Berlin Wall, he casually mentioned that almost every one of his drivers was an officially employee, the so-called IM, for the Stasi. And they had been chosen to listen to what my father talked about, both on duty and in private, and these drivers were always there to transport our family from point A to B on vacation, for example. And looking back, I remember it well that certain drivers always ask me a lot of questions. That's bizarre, right? It's
Yeah, I see where you're coming from there. Were you told within the family not to discuss certain things outside of the house?
No, not at all. Not at all. No, we were talking like any other families, about problems, about the family, about life, everything, and no, there wasn't not such thing that we had to be afraid that somebody is spying on us, For me, it's still a little scary, this whole situation.
And have you requested you or your father's Stasi files?
The answer to that is actually no. But I keep thinking about whether I should do it because I would be actually interested. On the other hand, I think I might wake up sleeping dogs, as we say in German. I know some people who have told me that names of people you would never have expected to be spying on you appeared there. And that still keeps me from reading these files. Can you understand this a little?
Yeah, I can, and I've had that answer from a number of East German citizens who I've interviewed. That sort of, and we have the same phrase in English. It would be "let sleeping dogs lie."
Yeah. That is,
and I think I can understand that. That you might be opening what we in the UK would say a can of worms.
Yes, or the box of the Pandora is also.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah. No, better not.
So, 1989, November the 9th. How do you become aware of the opening of the wall in Berlin?
Oh, yeah, that's a story. As I mentioned before, I started my training at the Council of Ministers of the GDR in Leipzig in 1986. And when I finished my apprenticeship in 1988, I returned to Rostock for a short time and worked there in a guest house of the Council of Ministers, in which I also met family Krenz, Egon Krenz, which one I still have a very warm and friendly relationship to this day. But you know how young people are. They went to conquer the world and all doors were open to me. And a very classy 5-star hotel was opening in Berlin called the Grand Hotel and was located on the famous Friedrichstraße. At the time, it was the only and most prominent hotel in the GDR that existed. It was noble and very upscale. I wanted to work there and feel a breath of the big wide world, And my father knew the director of the Komische Oper Berlin, the opera in Berlin, very well. And he in turn knew the director of this hotel, because the two houses were right next to each other. And so I was then allowed to send my application to Berlin. And of course, my father's relationships there helped me a lot, because even in establishments like the 5-star Grand Hotel, they are valued employees who had a good reputation, and that's how I got the job. And a few months after I graduated from my apprenticeship, I was able to start my new dream job in Berlin, and I was so happy about it. And of course, this also included moving to Berlin. And for the time being, I was allowed to stay in the house of the directors of the opera. He and his wife were childless and had a huge house in Berlin and were very happy that I would move in. And I started working at the Grand Hotel Berlin on September 1st in 1989. And I was employed in the Chinese restaurant on Friedrichstraße, which was only accessible to guests from the capitalist foreign countries. And they're only paid in hard currencies, for example, in D-mark and dollars and etc. And I again had the privilege of benefiting from a well-trusted family with strong GDR roots, which was politically clearly oriented, and one did not have to fear that I would become weak in any way or let myself be blinded, by Western influences. And at this time, the unrest in the GDR was already obvious. There were large waves of immigration to Hungary, and the demonstrations in Leipzig and Dresden also reflected the dissatisfaction of the citizen with the system. And this was a view I could not share. I had just turned 19 and believed that the world in all its diversity would lay before me, and I also never had the feeling that something was missing in my home country. So it happened that on November 9th, 1989, I had a day off and I sat in front of the TV with my host family at 8 p.m. in the evening. And the current camera was on, the news program of the GDR television. I don't know if you ever heard of. the name. And this is when they broadcasted the famous and legendary press conference in which Günter Schabowski incorrectly announced the opening of the borders to West Germany. And this mistake had a huge media impact and finally caused the fall of the Berlin Wall. Incredible. And I sat in front of the TV and I couldn't believe what I saw and what I heard. And first I called my place of work and I asked what was going on Checkpoint Charlie, and which was right next to our restaurant. And all my colleagues were extremely excited and told me that long lines had been forming for hours in front of the border for crossings. I was shocked. And what the hell was going on, And I called my parents and told my father with great excitement about what was going on in Berlin. And he had just returned from a health retreat and, of course, had noticed in the past few weeks what was going on in the GDR. And I would like actually to quote my father as he wrote it down in our family chronicles. He said, "I did not understand why the GDR government and the party did not react in time, made no statements, and certainly did not plan any reforms to respond to the current shortcomings in the country. Erich Honecker was ill at that time, and we still believe that when he returns to office, things will change. These hopes turned out to be wrong." These are my father's thoughts. And I would like to add that the 40th anniversary of the GDR was celebrated shortly beforehand on October 7, and there were many major events on this occasion. Among other things, there were a parade in Berlin. And my father said also all the plans made to mark the 40th anniversary of the Republic in Berlin left the impression that the party and government of the GDR were living on a different planet. Great hopes were placed in the visit of the Soviet leader back then, Gorbachev. There was a big disappointment as no action by the GDR leaders followed and things looked as rosy as before without any light at the end of the tunnel for a chance. Yeah.
And when did your father write down those lines that you just read?
Actually, in the middle of the 90s, he was writing down his chronicle for the Navy and for our family. And this came like in the middle of the 90s, 96, 97, so around this time. So, which I find very, very great that he left us this opinions or this thoughts, which is
it's absolutely fascinating hearing this story and also hearing your father's comments in here as well. One question I wanted to ask you about the Grand Hotel and working in the Chinese restaurant.
Mm-hmm.
Were you ever approached by the Stasi to give them information about foreign visitors or any conversations you overheard or anything like that?
No, not at all. But I think that some people work with me. I'm pretty sure that there was like also from the Stasi and spying on us and us in working places. So I can't really prove that, but I'm pretty sure there were people spying around us. Maybe a cook or some kind of chef from the service or some restaurant leader or something like this. But I'm actually pretty sure about this.
And they probably wouldn't want to ask the daughter of a high-ranking Vice Admiral to do anything like that. They're probably worried, we're going to get into big trouble if we ask Katja to,
Yeah,
act as an IM.
Yeah, no, I think this is not a good idea, or have not been a good idea, for sure. Oh my goodness.
So we're still there on the 9th of November 1989 in Berlin.
Yeah.
What did you do that night, and what did you see that night?
Oh, yeah, that is quite something, As I mentioned, I found out about the opening of the border at home with my host family. And after the phone call with my father, who warned me not to do anything silly and who still had questions about the statements Schabowski made, I got on the subway and drove to my workplace at Friedrichstraße in Berlin. Because I wanted to see with my own eyes what happened there, And when I arrived, there was a great hectic and huge excitement, and hundreds of people had already met on Friedrichstraße, and it was around 10 p.m. And more people came. I seriously wondered how this would end up. And my colleagues were telling me what had happened in the last few hours since the press conference with Schabowski, but the overall mood remained peaceful, and only the border guards at Checkpoint Charlie were increasingly posted directly in front of the fence with their rifles loaded. Very scary. And my colleagues there said they would also get in line in front of the border after work and were wondering if I would join them. And I was horrified with the thought of joining them. Unbelievable for me. And everyone said if the borders were open, we would go over to West Berlin and see how it looks there. And I sat at the staff table with a drink in my hand and couldn't believe what was going on. And in my wildest dreams, I couldn't imagine crossing the border to West Berlin. And we looked out of the window again. Meanwhile, there were thousands of peoples who had formed a large crowd in Friedrichstraße. But nothing really moved, and no one took a step direction to the border, because it was still closed, And I have to say that the message, as it was announced on television, was, of course, not immediately spread out, certainly not in the form of clear orders to the guards to open the borders. So it took hours to actually open. And in the meantime, all my colleagues had finished their work, and it was around 11 p.m. There was a really great euphoria. Everyone wanted to be there, and infected by this euphoria, me and my work colleagues lined up on Friedrichstraße and somehow joined the crowd and not knowing what was going to happen. And we stood very close together, and everyone was saying something different, but everyone agreed that it was only a question of time that the borders were going to open up. But nothing happened, and no one moved an inch in the direction of the Checkpoint Charlie barrier, which went on for about 2 hours. And we were right in the middle of it, and actually already were getting tired. But suddenly there was a wave through the crowd, and we went forward. So incredible. And people began to shout and cheer with joy, and we are the people. And it went forward step by step towards the barrier. And I knew that the distance was at most 150 meters, but it felt like it was a mile, trapped in the crowd and constantly pushed forward. There was no escape for me. And then came the moment, I'm getting very emotional now, when I stood with my colleagues in front of the white stripe. that represented the border and the large sign, "You are entering the American sector," showed like a final threatening warning before my eyes. I stood still for seconds in front of this white stripe, looked at the floor, and thought of my father and what all this would do to him, and whether my actions now and here could have serious consequences for our whole family. If I did cross the stripe, nothing will be the same as it used to be. This was absolutely clear to me, and then there was another wave from behind, and I was pushed over the stripe, and I stood in the West, in the evil West, which I was told for years was fundamentally bad, exploited people, and was only money driven. And it's a challenge to describe how I felt at the moment. And overwhelmed with emotions and feeling of guilt, it felt unreal, like completely under drugs, because I realized that I was experiencing a unique moment in time that many others will later only know from the history books. This is pretty crazy. And the whole East German crowd took the subway to the world-famous Kurfürstendamm, which we thought we would never see in our lives. And when we got off there and saw the many lights and advertisements, we were simply speechless, and our hearts almost stopped. We never had seen anything like this before, another world, like another planet, actually. We were so fascinated and could hardly recover from the never-ending flood of new impressions. And we walked through the city together, marveled at everything, and felt like we were in a movie. This couldn't all be true, Oh, my goodness.
Wow, Katja, that's an incredible description, particularly you telling me about you're in front of that white line.
Yes.
And you're worrying about the implications of what that might be for your family to step over that 6 inches of white paint on the ground.
Really, really challenge and very hard for me. Even if I tell you this today, it brings up so many feelings and emotions. It's crazy. It's crazy. I really can't believe it, that it still touches me so much.
I really appreciate you sharing that with me. That's an incredible account there. At some point, you told your father that you'd done that. I mean, how did he react to the knowledge that you'd crossed into West Berlin? And loyal listeners, that's where I'm afraid we're going to have to finish for today. You'll be able to hear what Katja's father says to her in 2 weeks' time, so make sure you watch out for that episode. The episode extras, such as videos, photos and other content, are available via a link in the episode information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous efforts of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and look forward to seeing you next week.